How does a boy born into poverty become the richest man in the world? Andrew Carnegie is the personification of the American dream, an extraordinary rise from the very bottom to the absolute top. However, I must warn you, there are two different sides to Andrew Carnegie. On the one hand, he was a hypocrite. He preached about workers' rights publicly, and yet privately he slashed his workers' wages, significantly increased their working hours, and essentially exploited his staff as slave labor in barbaric, dangerous conditions to build his fortune. He destroyed unions, and his actions resulted in countless unnecessary, brutal deaths. And yet, on the other hand, Andrew Carnegie may be the greatest ever philanthropist. After becoming the richest man in the world, he then spent the rest of his life giving almost all of that money away. He funded universities, schools, and nearly 3,000 free public libraries around the world to help others improve their own position in life. He's also responsible for incredible innovation that helped build America and change the way we do business. Carnegie's story is both inspiring and shocking, and involves several other business titans. For example, Carnegie was bitter rivals with Rockefeller, and also ended up making the biggest business deal in history with JP Morgan. But before all that wealth and drama, we need to travel back to 1835, where a young boy is born into abject poverty. Andrew Carnegie was born in Scotland, which is the reason I'm saying Carnegie instead of Carnegie, because this is how the Scots actually pronounce it. But Andrew's start in life was depressing to say the least. His first home consisted of just one main room inside a small cottage, which the Carnegies shared with another family. Andrew's father was a loom weaver, making cloth by hand, and Andrew had expected he would do the same thing when he was older. But then along came the Industrial Revolution and steam-powered looms, which put hand weavers like Andrew's father out of business. Suddenly, the little income the family had was gone. In order for the family to have enough money to survive, Andrew's mother stepped up and began working extremely long hours repairing shoes for people in the nearby area. Meanwhile, Andrew witnessed his father begging for work, a haunting image that would stick with him for the rest of his life. But it was soon clear that there was no real prospects left for the family in Scotland, and Andrew's mother had heard stories from her sisters in America that the US was the land of opportunity. So in 1848, the family sold all of their possessions and used the money to embark on a one-way trip to America in search of a better life. The family arrived in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which was a hub for manufacturing, but both of Andrew's parents struggled to find consistent work. So Andrew dropped out of school after just 5 years of education, as he knew the family needed him to find work and provide another source of income to support themselves. At the age of 12, Andrew's father found him work in a cotton mill, working 12 hours a day and making $1.20 per week. Andrew would later reflect that no amount of money ever made him happier than that first paycheck. He felt proud to be helping his family out in some way, and better yet, Andrew was soon promoted to be engineer's assistant, where he stoked the boilers in the textile factory. It was slightly better pay, but the job literally gave him nightmares. He'd wake up sweating that there'd been an accident at the factory and he'd been engulfed in flames. So by the time he was 14, Andrew had found himself another job, this time working as a messenger boy at a local telegraph office. His job consisted of him biking all over the Pittsburgh area to deliver telegrams. Not only did this job pay more, $2.50 per week, but it gave him the chance to meet influential people within the city's business community as he delivered them telegrams. Andrew learned who the most important and influential people in the area were, and made sure to memorize their names and faces so that if he ever saw them in the street, he could say hello. And this strategy worked. Andrew soon caught the attention of a man named Thomas Scott, a regional manager for the Pennsylvania Railroad Company, a huge business and the largest railroad in the country. Tom took a liking to Andrew and hired him to be his personal telegrapher and private secretary. Andrew's wages jumped up to $35 per month. But even more importantly, this was a massive opportunity to see firsthand how a major corporation was run. Andrew immediately showed great potential, and thus Tom Scott decided to essentially mentor him. It's believed Tom saw something of himself in Andrew. They'd both started out very poor, but had huge amounts of ambition and work ethic. But for Andrew, this connection would prove to be invaluable, as Tom Scott would later become president of the entire company. And since Andrew was Tom's protege, Andrew advanced up the company's ranks quickly as well. He worked closely with Tom to oversee the railroad expansion. There's no doubt this mentorship played a pivotal role in Andrew's future, and helped him understand the ins and outs of running a profitable business. The two had a close bond, and Tom fondly referred to Andrew as my boy Andy. However, whilst things were looking up for Andrew's future, they weren't for his father. After 7 years in America, Andrew's father died age 51, a broken man, and a victim of the Industrial Revolution. One day, Andrew came home from work to see his mother crying, and he vowed to her then and there he would become rich and take care of her. Whilst Andrew said this with conviction, there's no way either of them could have possibly guessed just how crazy things were about to get. Andrew worked closely with Tom as they developed bigger cars and longer trains, meaning they could cover bigger loads and cut costs. Their railroad was also the first to keep trains moving 24 hours a day. Not only was Andrew learning a lot about business, but also about money. One day, Tom approached Andrew and told him to buy shares of a stock called Adams Express. It very quickly shot up in value, and it was the first time Andrew had made money so easily without doing any actual work. Now, this was blatant insider trading, of course, but Tom instilled in Andrew the idea of your money working for you, rather than you doing manual labor for money like Andrew had been used to. As Andrew continued to rise through the ranks at the railroad company, aided by his mentor, he was becoming increasingly well off, which meant that when the American Civil War came around in 1861, Andrew paid a substitute to take his place on the battlefield rather than fighting himself. By 1865, when he was 30 years old, Andrew was making more than $50,000 a year. However, Andrew was always looking for that next big opportunity, and so at this point, he decided it was time to leave the Pennsylvania Railroad and head to New York City with his mother, where they got a suite at one of New York's most fashionable hotels. Finally, he could give his mother a true taste of luxury. Once he got to New York, he began managing a business called the Keystone Bridge Company. That's because whilst working for the railroad, Andrew had foreseen the need for iron bridges to replace wooden bridges, and so he capitalized on the opportunity. However, the Keystone Bridge Company didn't just build bridges. Andrew made sure to apply the lessons he'd learned from his mentor and vertically integrate production, meaning they had their own iron mills to produce the iron for bridges rather than relying on iron mining and extraction companies like their competitors. This gave Andrew more control and the ability to cut costs, so he could offer better prices and dominate the market. Not just that, but Andrew had something most of his competitors didn't: connections in the railroad industry. He was able to sell a lot of bridges to rail companies looking to expand their routes thanks to the contacts Andrew had previously made. And one day, Andrew was approached with an intriguing proposition: building the largest rail and road bridge in America at the time, over a mile long, that would span the Mississippi River and connect east to west like never before. This would be a game changer for the railroads, but it quickly became clear why nobody had done this before. A normal bridge would not withstand the Mississippi current. They would need a stronger building material like steel, but at the time it was extremely expensive and difficult to make in large quantities. That's why steel was used for small items like cutlery and jewelry, but certainly not for a huge structure like the bridge Andrew was planning. But Andrew felt convinced that steel was the future. If they could find a way to make steel cheaper, it could revolutionize not just bridges, but all kinds of different buildings. Andrew became fixated on the idea. He looked out across the Mississippi River and could envision his creation. He knew big rewards required risk, and so he threw himself fully into the project and began seeking a way to produce large quantities of steel. He traveled all around the country to different steel mills and chemists to try and learn everything he could. For a while though, it seemed like a lost cause, until someone finally introduced him to an English inventor called Henry Bessemer. Bessemer had created a new way of refining steel from molten pig iron that was was much more efficient and cost-effective. The Bessemer converter, which was a pear-shaped furnace, allowed for the mass production of steel on a scale never seen before. It cut the time to manufacture a single steel rail from 2 weeks to 15 minutes, something that was previously believed to be impossible, and it was exactly what Andrew needed. It would still be expensive to set everything up, of course, but Andrew saw the potential and invested almost everything he had in this new technology from Bessemer and began to adapt it to his needs. He was willing to invest heavily in building a gigantic steel production plant, something very few other entrepreneurs were willing to take a gamble on, but Andrew just had pure belief in the idea and went all in. Once he'd also got some additional investors to help him finance it, Andrew wasted no time in setting up his first steel mill using these Bessemer converters that could produce large volumes of steel. And after years of grueling work, the bridge over the Mississippi River was successfully built, the first ever steel structure of this size. It was a huge accomplishment, but there was one big problem. Nobody believed a bridge that big across a river was safe. Back then, bridges collapsing was not uncommon, and people weren't used to seeing bridges this size, so Andrew had to prove it was safe. Now, at the time, a popular superstition was that elephants would not walk across foundations that were unstable. So, Andrew had an idea. On the opening day of the bridge, where the public gathered to see what would happen, Andrew arranged for a circus elephant to lead a parade across the bridge. When it crossed successfully, people followed behind feeling reassured, and the bridge was officially open for business. The Eads Bridge, as it's now called, is still there today, built with Carnegie steel. But for Andrew, he was no longer just thinking about bridges. With his new steel mill able to create steel in such large volumes, it was time to start thinking much bigger.